an immigrant from 1974. My career began in 1980, really, in journalism at the government press office when Menachem Begin was still prime minister. After that, after a brief time at the Jerusalem Post, 25 years at Israel Broadcasting, Israel Television, and now that's defunct, so I have time to host events and things. So we're very fortunate today to be joined by our guest speaker, Professor Dan Schueftan. The subject of today's talk is Arab Attitudes Towards Israel 50 years after the Khartoum Summit. Just to remind everyone, the summit concluded on September 1st, 1967, in the wake of the Six-Day War in Khartoum. 8 Arab heads of state from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, Kuwait, and Sudan were there. And the resolution called for the continued state of belligerency against Israel. The famous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with it, and the insistence on the right of the Palestinian people in their own country. Without further ado, I'm going to turn to Dan. After he completes his talk, if there's time, because we have a 1-hour time limit, if there's time for questions, of course we'll turn to questions. If not, I have some of my own prepared. Professor Schueftan.
Thank you. Well, since we're speaking to journalists, I'll start with the conclusions. I'll start with the end, and then I'll try to explain how we got there. If we look 50 years back, there are a few things that have changed very dramatically, and a few things that haven't changed. Let me very shortly say what hasn't changed is the Middle East is a dangerous region, a region that is structurally unstable, very violent, with a lot of radicalism present. What has changed, and very favorably changed, is that 50 years ago, radicalism was much more dangerous than it is today. Against what we intuitively think, counterintuitively, at the time, radicalism was much more dangerous. It may have been somewhat less prevalent, but it was much more dangerous. Because at the time, the radical movement in the Middle East was led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, who could mobilize the entire Arab world, and the whole region functioned under a radical dictate. Because Gamal Abdel Nasser was a radical, he tried to change not only the realities in the Middle East, but the global balance of power, and he managed to mobilize the support of the overwhelming majority of the elites throughout the Middle East, even if the governments in these countries did not want to share his view, did not want to apply radical policies. They didn't have much of a choice, because basically his message was, be with us or you will not be, because your own elites in your own countries will topple you. And Nasser had a very successful attempt for a while to have a major effect on the global balance of power, because he used very skillfully the Cold War by working with the Soviet Union and convincing the Americans, most of the time that we're discussing, that whereas he's more or less working for the Soviets, they need to support him too, because otherwise he may be working for the Soviets. So he had a very good deal. On the one hand, the Soviets supported him because it was good to them, and the Americans supported him because they were dumb. So that's a great combination. Both sides support you, one because they know what they're doing in Moscow, and one in Washington having this illusion. You know that Americans have this fundamental flaw in their thinking. They believe that in every Saddam Hussein there is a little Thomas Jefferson trying to come out, only he had a difficult childhood and we need to help him. So when you see a radical, instead of breaking his face and hanging him on a lamppost, you better talk to him, persuade him, show him how nice the Americans are, persuade him that they're not like the British or the French colonialists, And then, of course, everybody wants democracy. We've seen it in Iraq. Everybody wants to have a good life, and a good life means a good life the way Americans understand a good life. And the understanding that in the Middle East, a good life means kill your neighbor is something that Americans cannot accept, because this is racism. It means that there is a cultural difference between Arabs and Americans, and of course, the very notion that you have cultural differences is racism, and therefore the Americans have this great understanding of the Middle East with the great successes in the region. And Nasser understood it very, very well. He used it in a brilliant way with Eisenhower. Eisenhower learned his lesson, but Kennedy came back to the illusionary notion of let's help Nasser and then he will be on our side. And when Johnson came with a very different approach, and I think a much more helpful approach, Nasser tried to force the United States to adopt the old policy that they had in the 1950s. And the Six-Day War came at a place where he expected the Americans to work for him, namely what he wanted, and this is what the Khartoum Resolution was all about, is to say, I played my game, I punched above my weight, I tried to play with the powers as if I am a power, as if a backwards state like Egypt, representing a backwards part of the world that is incapable of dealing with the challenges of the modern world, can play in the league of the powers. I did it, the Americans fell for it, it's working for me. Now came the Six-Day War and they want to change the balance of power. In other words, they want to push Egypt and the Arab world where they belong, namely with the countries who have very little influence on the global reality and who cannot dictate their will using the force of the great powers. And the Khartoum conference was about defiance, about saying, we know we have been defeated militarily, but we will not be defeated politically. What we need is to restore the situation that existed before the war. And therefore, we will destroy the Israeli strategy, and the Israeli strategy at the time was basically 48 for 67. Namely, you want what we've occupied in 1967 vis-a-vis Egypt. Okay, accept what we have managed to do, namely establish a Jewish state in 1948. If you will give us peace, namely you will recognize that 48 is unchangeable, then we will give you territory. You can have the Sinai Peninsula. And 11 days after the Six-Day War, the Israeli government decided that the Egyptians and the Syrians can get what they've lost in the war if they will give Israel peace, namely a deal of 67 for 48. And the whole purpose of the Khartoum Resolution and the whole policy of Nasser between 67 and 1970 was to say, you think you can change the balance of power in the region, I will show you that you cannot do it, I will demonstrate that you cannot do it, and therefore Israel will get no 48, namely no peace, no recognition, no negotiations, not giving up the rights of the Palestinians, which is the code word for the elimination of Israel. And in spite of it, we will force Israel to give us the Sinai Peninsula at least back, if not Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Golan Heights alongside with it. And the Israelis will get nothing like in 1957, because this is what happened in 1957. The Israelis had a military victory, and then the Americans, in their infinite wisdom, destroyed NATO, undermined the French and the British, supported the Soviets and their worst enemy in the so-called non-aligned world, namely Nasser. And remember, this was not Obama, although he would have done even worse. This is Eisenhower at the end of his first period. Eisenhower 57 is already somewhat different with the Eisenhower Doctrine. Eisenhower 58 is different because everything in the Middle East collapsed because of the American folly. But what Nasser always wanted was a 1957, I'm quoting from Nasser's own words, a 1957 kind of arrangement in the Middle East. Namely, the Israelis give everything, get nothing, because otherwise the Egyptians will mobilize the Arab world against America, and America should be very afraid of it. And the terminology for this, and this was the terminology after the Khartoum resolution, was what we want is liquidation of the consequences of aggression, elimination of the consequences of aggression. Namely, there's been an international crime, namely the Israeli aggression of 1967. We will eliminate it, namely the Israelis will give back what they have plundered, and they will get nothing for it because the criminal doesn't deserve compensation for giving up what he has stolen from others. And this was the whole way Arabs talked. Everybody in the Arab world had to talk, even when many of them, and King Hussein, perhaps one of the most interesting, understood that the balance of power has changed in a very fundamental way, but this is how they talked. Let me perhaps give you an example to demonstrate it. You know a very good quotation by Churchill in the Second World War. He said, "I did not become the king's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." And then he started presiding over the liquidation of the British Empire because there was no British Empire after the Second World War. The only thing you could do is to preside over the liquidation of it. So they said it, and they tried to persuade the Americans to do it, and some Americans were persuaded, but the Israelis and Johnson personally said to the Egyptians, if you don't modify in a very major way your policy, you will not get what you want. In other words, you will not get everything for nothing, because you may huff and you may puff, but we are not three little piglets sitting in a straw house. Okay? You're huffing and puffing, we're not very impressed. And the question was, will Nasser be able to frighten the United States because he can mobilize the non-aligned world and of course the Arabs against the United States? And it didn't work, because Johnson was not exactly the type. Some of you may have read about Johnson. This was not exactly the softest person that I know. His best quotation, one that I would put on my old sign if I had one, when Kennedy said we have to reach the hearts and minds of people, Johnson is reported to have said, once you've got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. This is not exactly somebody who you can very easily frighten. This is not an Obama. This is not a Kennedy. This is Johnson. It's very, very different. It's not a Jimmy Carter. Okay, this is somebody who believed in having a very forceful policy, and this idea, give us what we want or else, he answered by saying, okay, or else what? What can you do? What can a backwards country representing a backwards community or collection of nations do to the American superpower? And Nasser's policy, and this is fascinating, we don't have time to deal with it, but I will just give you an overview. His idea was, I can bring the Middle East to the brinks of a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, unless you give me what I want. And he started doing it, and if we did not have here people like Johnson and Nixon and Kissinger and Golda Meir, he would have succeeded, because it was frightening. His policy was, draw the Soviet Union in. The Soviets cannot afford not to support Egypt, because if the Soviet Union allowed the Six-Day War to happen, and then they continue not to support Egypt, then every client will say the Soviet Union is not a superpower. So he started a war, the war of attrition, that he knew he would lose, but having lost the war, he can call the Soviets to deepen and deepen and deepen their involvement until the point where in the summer of 1970, actually the Red Army is fighting Israel on the Suez Canal. And then the question is, when the Soviets, with their massive direct intervention of Soviet forces on the Suez Canal, air defense forces, Air Force, this was all Soviet because the Arabs were incapable of dealing with the Israelis. But when the Soviets came in with the massive power of a superpower, Israel could not go on. And then the question from an American point of view, and this is exactly what Nasser wanted, either let Israel be defeated by the Soviet Union, America can't do it, or risk a confrontation with the Soviet Union by becoming involved, the United States itself, against the Soviet forces, and that's the threat of a nuclear confrontation. And if we had, sitting in Washington and in Jerusalem, anybody less determined and less forceful than Nixon and Kissinger and Golda Meir, it would have worked. And it didn't. And when Nasser died, and he died of a broken heart, I mean, I'm not a physician, I'm giving you a political, he failed in everything he touched after 1967, and the failure was enormous and humiliating, and he died of a broken heart. By the way, at the time, they said that the gypsy came to Nasser and told him, you will die on a Jewish holiday. And he asked, which Jewish holiday? He said, it doesn't matter, any day you die will be a Jewish holiday. So we had a Jewish holiday in 1970 in September, when many other things went very well, including King Hussein liquidating the control of the PLO in Jordan. And when Nasser died and Sadat took over, he changed the Egyptian policy in two very important ways. First of all, he recognized in a very deep way that there are no two superpowers. There is one superpower and one third world state with nuclear power. Okay, the Soviet Union is not a superpower. Sadat understood it a long time before many others did. So you don't confront the United States counting on the Soviet Union. You just ask for a way to change orientation from the Soviet side to the American side, which Sadat was willing to do right from the very beginning. But in order to do it in a way that the Americans will respect you and not accept it as a sign of weakness, he had first to show how much he can damage America, and then to show how much he can help America. So first he had to go to war. First he combined with the oil-rich countries with the embargo. And when he demonstrated how dangerous he can be, and he literally brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brinks of a nuclear confrontation in October 1973, then he changed orientation dramatically from the Soviet side to the American side. And in this context, you have to understand the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War succeeded in its first week because Sadat started from the assumption that there is no way that Arabs can challenge the Israeli strategic supremacy. Arabs are simply incapable of it. They are backward societies or incapable of winning in the battlefield. But you can find a very tiny crack in the Israeli supremacy for a few days and for a few miles. For 10 miles, for 1 week. And for this week, you can shake the Middle East to the point where the Israelis will be in a very serious problem, and we were in the first days of the Yom Kippur War. And when the Israelis lift their arm in order to destroy Egypt, because Egypt doesn't stand a chance, it's a backward country who cannot fight Israel. When the Israelis get ready to destroy the Egyptian army, then all you have to do is to go out and say, Henry, please come. And this is exactly what he did in a brilliant way, a brilliant strategy. He made war for the first days where he could have succeeded in a limited area. And the moment he was on the brinks of defeat, he called in Henry Kissinger and said, if you will get me out of this war without being defeated, I will change orientation from the Soviet to the American side. And this is exactly what he did. And remember, the Soviet Union had Egypt as its crown jewel. Outside of Eastern Europe, this is by far the most important asset of the Soviet Union. So when Egypt basically says, you can't trust the Soviet Union, it's not a superpower, we are going over to the American side. We hate it, but there's no choice. It was a tremendous triumph for the United States, orchestrated brilliantly by Henry Kissinger. And the price was prevent the Israelis from destroying the Egyptian army. I mean, we had the Egyptian, 1/3 of the Egyptian army we had on the brinks of total destruction. I mean, we didn't have to shoot one bullet. They were encircled with no ammunition and no water. They would have died of thirst or capitulated. And then it opens the way for Israelis to do whatever they want. And then Kissinger came to Golda and told Golda, not only are you fatigued from a very difficult war, but remember one thing. If Egypt changes orientation, then this is probably the last war where Egypt will participate against Israel in a very long time, because Egypt needs to make war, to be defeated, and then the Soviet Union to give them a new army. We will not give them a new army, so if you will refrain from destroying the Egyptian military forces, which the Israelis could do after the 22nd of October 1973, then we will deliver a situation where you may have lost the battle, but you have won the war. Because once Egypt is out of the equation, the rest of the Arab world is not a match for Israel in any way, because Egypt is more important than the rest of the Arab world combined. So once Egypt goes to American orientation, then the story is over. And this is basically what happened. So we have a policy represented by the Khartoum resolutions that Nasser pursued. This policy completely failed. Sadat came in, took an alternative policy. Later, he even accepted a peace treaty with Israel. This is not something he had in mind in 1973, certainly not in 71, but also not in 1973. In 1973, in 1977, there was something else. We don't have time to discuss it unless you're very interested. What brought Sadat to Jerusalem was the folly of Jimmy Carter, one of the dumbest presidents that you can possibly imagine, who did the wrong thing about practically everything, and in foreign policy. I don't know anything about American domestic policy. And Sadat was so afraid of Jimmy Carter destroying everything in the Middle East that he said making peace with Israel is better than allowing Jimmy Carter to destroy everything Egypt has achieved and every sacrifice it made in 1973. So in 1977, when we have a peace treaty with Egypt that accepts 48 for 67 legitimately, namely gives Israel exactly what Israel wanted a decade earlier, this is something that gives you an overall picture of the change of policy. Now, this is also very relevant to what I said in the very beginning concerning radicalism in the region. Radicalism in the late 60s the Middle East was dominated by a radical Arab leader who could either persuade people to be radical like him or to force them to act in a radical way like him. Namely, he could either take the radicals in the Arab world and say, join me, or come to King Hussein and say, you want peace, but you will make war because otherwise your own people will kill you. Okay? And that's what King Hussein did. I mean, the Jordanian army was under Egyptian leadership in 1967 on the 5th of June. The Jordanian army was brought into the war without King Hussein being involved. He could only say yes to what the Egyptian general who was in control of the Jordanian army was doing in the service of Nasser. So at the time, there was only radicalism because the non-radical forces couldn't stand up to the radical forces because they were afraid they will be deposed. We have a lot of radicals in the Middle East, and by the way, this is the permanent feature of this region. The Arab Street is radical, was radical, and for the foreseeable future will be radical and will support radical leaders. But if you look at the people who are in power, because they can also be led by Egypt, namely the most important Arab state today, is not radical. And the most important Arab state today is even willing to... Can we perhaps do all this later? Oh, okay. Thank you. No, we have an intrusion here.
which stated that
No. Let me just wait for a second. I have very little to say, and then we can open the floor for questions. Okay, thank you. Today, you have a completely different situation. Today, the Egyptians not only know that they must cooperate with Israel, they have intimate relations with Israel. Okay, if you look on the military level, if you look at the amount of trust you have today between President Sisi and Israel, let me put it to you this way. Until recently, President Sisi trusted two people, his mother and Amos Gilad. And then his mother passed away. So the Israeli general became the only person that President Sisi actually trusted. We are in a situation where the Egyptians, the Israelis, the Jordanians, the Saudis are not only have the same interest, we may have had similar interest even after under Nasser with the Jordanians and the Saudis, but they were afraid to confront Nasser. Now the challenge comes from a non-Arab, non-Sunni element, namely from Iran and the proxies of Iran. So you have a situation today where the dominant element in the Sunni world is not radical. So the radicalism is very prevalent but much less dangerous because Egypt is on the good side from an Israeli perspective, not on the bad side. On the good side from an American perspective. If the Europeans knew what the European perspective were, they would have been on the European perspective on the good side. Okay? Not that they have a clue about what's going on, but they are supporting relative stability in an area that is structurally unstable, and if I may coin a new word in the English language, unstabilizable. Okay? This is a region that is very violent, very unstable. It has to do with Arab political culture. It explains also why the Arab world is a major failure in every aspect you can possibly imagine. And the last difference, and by the way, here I'm not sure it's a good thing, it has good and bad implications. 50 years ago, the Middle East was a region of hope, where people said, we are in a bad situation, but we know what to do, and if we follow Gamal Abdel Nasser, everything will be rosy, and they had a great hope. Today, it's a region of hopelessness and despair. And when I speak today on Al Jazeera in Arabic, and I say the Arabs are the worst failure in modern history, somebody on the other side, I don't even know who's talking to me because I have no monitor or just a camera in my face, somebody else on the other side says you're right. Because today, there is a recognition in the Arab world of a profound failure. So, here is the interesting thing. Hope brings radicalism because they believe they can change things. And despair brings radicalism because they believe that it's more important to hurt the people they envy than to give their children a better life. Wherever you go, you reach radicalism. But the radicalism of today is less dangerous than the radicalism we had at the end of the 1960s. So now it's exactly half hour after we started, and we have another half hour, I hope, for some disagreement, because I enjoy confrontation. I don't only study conflicts, I try to generate them. So let's have some.
Yes, sir.
You said something about the attitude of Egypt towards Israel. And
Can you please tell me?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Johannes Gerloff. I'm working for a different German media.
Okay, which one?
Different newspapers. I'm a freelancer.
Okay.
One is a television program called Focus Jerusalem. My question is, you talked about Egypt and the attitude of the Egyptian leadership. Could you say something about the attitude of the Arab people? Did that change?
The Arab street.
The Arab street. Did that change? I mean, we see that Egypt basically is a dictatorship also today, and we had free elections and they look different. So, could you say something about the street?
politically aware Arabs, when it comes to the public scene, will mostly be radical. And the reason for it is cultural, and it goes very deep to the distinction between the world as it should have been and the world as it is. And if I may, my students I can force to read, here I can only recommend, there is an excellent book called The Dream Palace of the Arabs by Fuad Ajami. In my view, one of the best descriptions about the Middle East, understanding what is going on here in the deep cultural sense of the term. Arabs have a very vivid perception of themselves as the leaders of the world, as the element that dominates the world. And it comes understandably from their glorious past in the 7th century and a few hundreds of years later. And on the one hand, they realize how powerful and how respected they used to be. And on the other hand, they also realize how powerless and insignificant they are today and how nobody respects them. I mean, it's very easy to find people who like Arabs or pity Arabs or fear Arabs. I haven't found many who respect Arabs. Okay? And I think this distinction is important. And they cannot deal with this enormous distinction between the glorious past and the completely inconsequential present and the very little hopes for the future. So they don't accept what I would call the Chinese system. The Chinese say something very similar. We used to be great, now we're very weak. Let us work for 200 years and we will be great again. The Arabs basically tell you, we used to be great. The reason we're not great today, you robbed us of our greatness, you usurped us of our greatness, and therefore we will kill you. Okay? They're not willing to build anything. In the last 100 years, Arabs have built nothing. When it comes to nation building, nothing. The reason everything around us is falling apart is the Arabs wasted the last 100 years. If you look at Egypt and you look at Israel, in the 1950s, we were more or less in the same situation. Or compare it not only to Israel, compare it to Taiwan, to South Korea, to Singapore, whatever, okay, in East Asia. In the 50s, we were all more or less in the same situation. Today, everybody is here, and they're here. And I doubt if they can close the gap, even if they start working very hard, because for the last 100 years, they have done nothing, or very, very little. And there are two kinds of people. People who want to succeed, and people who want to have good excuses why they failed. And Arabs have developed this excuse why they failed more than anybody else. Their excuses are brilliant. They don't even have to read the Haaretz in the morning in order to have a good excuse. The best excuses come from Haaretz, but they don't even have to read it, or European newspapers, which give them the excuse. For instance, to say, oh, it's imperialism. They had 30 years of imperialism light, okay? And they could have used it to their benefit the way the Jews used the Mandate period for benefit. I mean, we were the barbarians coming from Eastern Europe, and we learned from the British how to have a judicial system, how to have a civil service, okay? But 30 years colonialism light. Look at India, with hundreds of years of domination and exploitation and a very long period of imperialism, and they're doing something, and they're successful because instead of whining, they're working. What have the Arabs built in the last 100 years? Very, very, very little. And by the way, they were in a better position to build it than others because they had thousands of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars at their disposal, which they wasted 100% on wars and corruption. So what they have is rage. Instead of building a constructive approach, they have rage. And this rage you will find today in demonstrations against the Israeli embassy in Cairo, in demonstrations that you will find in Jordan, and even when their elite is very sophisticated and understands exactly why they must cooperate with Israel, the street is different. Let me give you an example, perhaps you're closer to it. Take Israeli Arabs, the Arab citizens of Israel. The majority of the citizens, the Arab citizens of Israel, are actually grateful that they live under Jewish domination, because they know that had they lived under Arab domination, they would slaughter each other the way that is happening throughout this region. And they're willing to say anonymously very interesting things about being proud to be Israeli. And yet they elect exclusively for the Knesset only the leaders who are the ultra-radicals that you can possibly imagine in terms of their verbal. They're not radicals when it comes to terrorism, because they know we'll crush them. But when it comes to their verbal behavior, they are the most ridiculous collection of people that you can possibly imagine, blaming everything on the Jews, because they're incapable of taking responsibility and incapable of building their own society. So you find this dissonance between people who are responsible and therefore behave responsibly, and the street that doesn't have any responsibility and just vents out its frustrations and is therefore very, very radical. You have Arab nations who used to be irresponsible, like Egypt under Nasser, and became responsible, Egypt under Sadat. And you have one nation that has never been responsible, namely the Palestinians, because they know that the Europeans care for their children in Gaza more than their own parents. Okay? And therefore they invest zero in their children and 100% every cent they have on missiles and tunnels. Okay? So when you have this kind of inability to build anything, and the inevitable failure that results from it, then all you have when you go out in the street is your frustration. But other than that, I'm an optimist.
Yes, sir.
I'm Walter Bingham, and my program is heard on Israel National Radio, Israel News Talk Radio in Melbourne. A week is a long time in politics, and considering that you said the Arab world, or probably includes Egypt, is structurally unstable. And now trying to make cost-benefit analysis of what happened after the war with Egypt did we get value for making peace by giving back Sinai and all that implies?
Let me put it this way. Even if we would have gotten much, much, much less, I would be for it. We got not only 40 years of no war. I mean, what we had since 1973 is not a war. The Lebanon War is not a war, not the first, not the second. War is what we had in 1948, in 67, in 73. We haven't had a war since 1973. This is enormously important because...
Would there have been more wars?
If Egypt would have not changed orientation, and if Nasser's radicalism would have succeeded, we would have had wars at least every decade. Yes. And we would have defeated them, so what? And then they built a new army. But the other point is that other Arabs would have generated war expecting the Egyptians to come to their aid. The fact that the most radical regime in the region, namely the Syrian, did not make war with Israel has only one reason: fear of Israel, because Egypt is not an option to join with Syria. So we didn't have war with Syria because Egypt was not there. We didn't have war with Iraq when Iraq still had a huge army because Egypt was not there. Okay? So the benefit was enormous, enormous. I would have given Sadat not only the Sinai Peninsula, I would have given him Mea Sha'arim and Bnei Brak, but this is just a revenge for what happened under Pharaoh. Okay? But the only thing in the Middle East that I like is the sense of revenge.
Why didn't they take Gaza?
Because he's smart. He didn't want Gaza. Okay? Because he's smart. Why should he? Who wants Gaza? Is there anybody that wants Gaza? I don't think the Gazans want Gaza. Because it's full of Gazans. Okay? Who wants it? What for?
Question, very short statement, very short question. Am I correct in thinking that amongst the many factors for instability in the Arab world, because instability has many parents, it seems to me there are many factors for instability. One of them seems to me to go back to the old question of settling disputes by a sultan. In other words, the difference between top-down and bottom-up government is the difference between taking responsibility and not. So therefore, in Arab society, two parties of quarreling don't meet in direct negotiation. A third party, a mukhtar, a sheikh, a rich man, a qadi, settles things. In fact, when Sadat spoke at the Knesset, a friend of mine, Menachem Milsom, told me he used the word sulh. He sort of forgave us for being here. He gave him backing. Now, there's such an essential difference between a government, more or less elected by the people to make decisions, good or bad, and others who expect people to set it for them. United Nations, America, this king, that king. How effective is this fissure in Arab thinking? How effective is that today?
First of all, third parties cannot make peace here because what the Arabs want is somebody to impose his will on Israel. So the United States can be very helpful and has been helpful. Even Jimmy Carter was helpful in Camp David after Sadat forced on him the idea of separate peace with Israel. But the United States cannot make peace, and if you want to have a very developed sense of humor, you can think about the Europeans making peace, but you really need a very developed sense of humor here. Third parties can help when the parties to the conflict themselves are willing to do it, and the parties to the conflict themselves will do it on the Arab side only if there is no other way from their point of view. For instance, the chances of settlement with the Palestinians have been zero, are zero, and will be zero for many, many reasons. One of them being the Palestinians always expect somebody from the outside to help them, and people from the outside are dumb enough to help them, and they believe that it brings peace. Okay. So the third parties are not the key. The cultural question is important, and what Menachem told you about sulh is very important, because when they used to say that they're willing to make peace with Israel, when Sadat said he's willing in 71 to make peace with Israel, he used the term salam. He explained the term salam as not being sulh, okay? In the Khartoum resolution, it doesn't say no salam, it says no sulh. And Sadat was willing to accept sulh. So terminology is important. But this is not the key. The question is not if you use the right term or not. The question is, do you realize that you must accept as a fait accompli the Jewish state of Israel. And the Palestinians until now are not willing to accept the fait accompli, the Jewish state of Israel. And then the terminology will be secondary, and the question of the mediation of something is almost negligible. It's not important. We had the greatest mediations possible with Arafat, and the option of making peace with Arafat was zero and inevitably exploded in our faces.
We're at about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to use my option to ask a question as well. Actually, two parts. Is there anything that Israel could and should be doing to encourage moderation in the Arab world? And obviously, the new administration in Washington is different in policy in the Middle East to the most recent administration. Is that policy moving the Arab world toward more moderation?
You cannot bring moderation, or democracy for that matter.
Not democracy.
No, even moderation to the Arab world from the outside. This is something that needs to come from the region itself, but you can prevent illusions as if you're willing to substitute difficult decisions on the Arab side. And I can't imagine somebody more incompetent than Obama when it comes to the Middle East. And even Trump, and believe me, this is difficult for me to say, even Trump is not as bad as Obama. Because Obama systematically supported all his enemies and undermined all his allies. Okay? By the way, not only in the Middle East, throughout the world. I can't imagine a more counterproductive president in the United States, and it's very difficult for me to say because on a personal level I would have liked Obama very much. He could have been my friend, he could have been my neighbor, he could have been in my PTA. I think this is where he belongs, more or less, not to the higher classes but to the lower classes. He's a nice guy, and therefore incapable of being the president of the United States. Moshe Dayan used to have a term that he used. He used to call certain people, he would say, this is a good guy in the bad sense of the term. And this is exactly what I think of Obama. He's really a good guy, but a good guy shouldn't be sitting in the White House, okay? In the White House, you need somebody. He was, I'm sorry, I don't know what the code is here. Let me use very foul language in describing Obama. He is a European. I'm sorry I have to go to stoop that low. He is a European. In other words, he is impotent. He is incapable of anything. And therefore, he encouraged Iran, and he encouraged the Palestinian radicals, and he had goodwill. But you know, there is a saying, let me use the original because the rest is a translation. Das Gegenteil von gut ist gut gemeint. Okay? The opposite of good is good intentions. He had good intentions, and they really paved the way to hell in the region. So now we have a better situation, not because Trump knows what he's doing, but because his basic sentiment is, I support my allies and I undermine my enemies. And therefore, in spite of the fact that I'm sure that the Russians have everything on him that people claim they have, he cannot be for the Russians because he has a certain image to present to his own political base that make it imperative for him to take a policy that will bring a confrontation with Putin. But more important, in this region, the Saudis, for the first time, know that America is on their side rather than on the Iranian side. That Sisi knows that the president is on his side rather than on Erdogan's side, because the bad guys in the region are the Iranians and the Muslim Brothers. And I don't want to say good guys, but the people you can work with are the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Israelis. And in that sense, we've had a positive shift. Although, because of the personality of this president, it's a very dangerous business. Okay? Now, the region is structurally unstable. But in this instability, you can work with the elements who make it less unstable, or
Yeah.
who have an interest to have it less unstable than others.
The White House, yeah.
Can you please explain to me why it is that every successive American president thinks he can do better than the last one in trying to make peace with Israel, and also and they did not realize the theorem of Einstein.
Which theorem of Einstein?
You try to do the same thing over and over.
Okay. Look, first of all, it's the Holy Grail. People have... Look, you cannot run for president and you cannot be a major politician without being a megalomaniac. Because otherwise, why would you suffer being a politician and the very... So you believe you can change the world. You believe you can do good things and so on. And if you harness it to a positive agenda, then you can do great. I think that the greatest president in the United States in foreign policy was Richard Nixon. Okay? The combination, not exactly a lovable person. I wouldn't like to have him as my neighbor. I wouldn't like to have him as my friend. But as a president of the United States, I think the combination of Nixon and Kissinger was brilliant, was great, was enormous achievements. But Kissinger, that has a big enough ego, said to himself, I want to bring peace between Israel and Egypt, and he managed. Carter wanted to bring peace with the whole Middle East, with the Russians, with the PLO, with the Syrians, and he wanted to bring peace to the whole world. And he wanted to end the tension between the North and the South. And he really was a believer. And when I see a believer, I clean my air raid shelter. Okay? Because people who believe in things, may really do things that are extremely dangerous. And with this one, because he is a megalomaniac, he wants to say, here is something that everybody wanted and he couldn't, and therefore I will do it, and it will make my hairstyle better, or something, okay? So, but very soon he will find out that you cannot do it, okay? That it's not an option. So then you can say, I tried and I didn't succeed because the people in the region don't want it. And he's right, okay? If he will, when he will inevitably say so. Huh? It also has to do with this idiotic notion that, again, is even more popular in Europe than today in America, is that if you settle the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you bring peace to the Middle East. These people have a developed sense of humor, okay? They think the whole region is peaceful, only the Palestinians and the Israelis don't get along, so I will come in and I will bring in goodwill. I hear goodwill, I clean my air raid shelter, okay? Because it will inevitably bring an idiot. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread.
Yeah.
I think we're just about the last question. Yes, sir.
As long as people are not leaving,
Now they have a limit with YouTube to an
so
hour.
let's not record it.
That's up to you.
If I'd be the next chancellor in Germany, I understood your attitude towards Europeans, but let me test you. If I'd be the next chancellor in Germany after September 24th, and I'd make you my advisor in Middle East affairs and the Arab world, what would you advise me?
First of all, be realistic. Second, don't make Israeli-German relations hostage to the Palestinian issue. It's ridiculous, more than anything else. Now that Heusgen is in the United Nations, I hope this is where he belongs, okay? Because for Heusgen, in the beginning, God created the settlements. And everything is the settlements, and everything, okay, fine. It's a pity, okay? So I would be very, look, Germany and Israel have a lot of common interests. Until the summer of 1915, I was an unconditional supporter of Angela Merkel, and after what she did with the refugees, I'm still a supporter of her because I look at the alternative. Okay, I would still vote for her because I look at the alternative, but I'm much less impressed by her because I think she made a major historic mistake with the way she treated the refugees.
How to rectify it?
First of all, by preventing physically people coming to Europe, not depending on the goodwill of Erdogan. Erdogan is a barbarian. If you give Erdogan the floodgates, he has the floodgates, you are paying protection in billions of dollars to a barbarian. This is what you're doing. Okay? And I think that they have learned the hard way in Berlin that Erdogan is dangerous for the German democracy, because the way he approaches the Turkish community in Germany, trying to radicalize them, is dangerous. It's also impertinent. Okay?
Taking your first advice, being realistic, knowing Syrians and what they went through during the past 10 years, is your advice to close the borders realistic?
Yes.
How can we do
Because the alternative of not closing the borders is having hundreds of millions of people marching to Europe. There are hundreds of millions of people who live in terrible conditions all over the world. If you say, I cannot maintain the borders of Europe, they will come from sub-Saharan Africa, they're coming from sub-Saharan Africa to Libya, and then you rescue them in the Mediterranean. All they have to do is to leave the Libyan coast. There is no limit to it. If you would have had a limited number, my problem with Angela Merkel was not wir schaffen es. My problem was keine Oberzahl. Okay? The idea, and then you will bring them to Europe and you will give a quota to every country. The Czechs won't do it, the Hungarians won't do it, the Poles won't do it. So the idea, we will be the good guys, we will be lovable, we will accept millions, and then we will let other Europeans take care of them. This will not work. Okay? This will not work. And at the moment, Alternative für Deutschland and Pagida are not a major danger, but they could become.
What do you mean by reminds me of Oberzahl?
That there is no limit to the number of refugees. Okay? The numbers are very important. Many things that work with small numbers don't work with big numbers. Now see what happens. We started with the Khartoum resolution and we ended with the refugees in Europe. But I don't mind. I have a prejudice about everything. Just
Yeah, but the Arab attitude today, or the Arab attitude in the street today, is what is relevant today to Europe.
the problem is that they're bringing with them to Europe two things: a smartphone and their political culture. Namely, what destroyed the Arab world, they now bring to Europe. They don't say, we failed because our culture is a failure, our political culture is a failure, let us have a good life like in Europe. But let us bring our political culture to Europe, our attitude to women to bring to Europe. Good luck.
Am I right that Merkel is better for Israel than Schulz? Because Schulz seems to have changed his mind.
I don't care if people are better for Israel or not better for Israel.
Oh.
No, I don't care. Because if somebody is good for... I don't care if an American president is a lover of Israel or an anti-Semite. I want him to be good for America. A strong America is good for Israel. A weak America is bad for Israel.
For the world.
For the world, yes. For the world, but also for us. Okay? If I would have had a choice in America today between an anti-Semite like Richard Nixon, or I think, subjectively seen, Obama, he is a lover of Israel,
But
like
the
Obama.
The situation in Germany is different. Germany is in Europe and
I know.
anti-Semitic Europe, and therefore we
I
have
know.
to find
Look, in
something.
Europe, Europe is not all anti-Semitic. In Europe, you have elements of the elite that have anti-Semitic elements, particularly when it comes to the journalistic elite, the artistic elite, the academic elite, but not all of them. I mean, look at Germany. You can't look at the German press. Okay, what? Die Zeit, Die Welt. What? Not even Süddeutsche Zeitung. Okay, Süddeutsche Zeitung will be critical of Israel in a legitimate way, mostly. But there are strong anti-Semitic elements in Europe. But Europe is not anti-Semitic. These are distinctions you need to make. Okay? But in Germany, I would like to have a strong Germany and a strong Europe and a weak European Union. I think the European Union is a major problem, not only for Israel, but also for Europe. Okay? If I were a European, I would have been a Eurosceptic. Okay? I am not altogether unhappy about Brexit.
You're not touching on Brexit.
Yeah? I want the British to renegotiate their position, and I want to weaken Brussels. Okay? Brussels is a danger to Europe.
Unelected.
Yes, many things, including that.
All right.
So,
What's left for me to do is to present Professor Schueftan with this card.
A membership card.
Membership card from the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm sure it'll be back way before the 75th anniversary of Khartoum. And there's so many other issues.
what do I do with this card?
Oh, there's many things, but I have no idea what they are.
You have a discount.
You get a discount in the restaurant.
Discount?
This big discount.